about love today.
I think you should get up and dance a little bit. Come on,
reggae
let's get some
rock
energy
for
in
ya.
this room.
Here we go.
All right.
Love is my religion.
That's easy to say.
Love is my religion. Love is my religion. I'll take you to the temple tonight. All my days I've been searching to find out what this life is worth. Through the books and Bibles of time, I've made up my mind. I don't condemn, I don't convert. This is the calling, have you heard? Bring all the lovers into the fold, 'cause no one is gonna lose their soul, yeah. Love is my religion. Love is my religion. Love is my religion. You can take it or leave it, but you don't have to believe it. I don't want to fight. No more fighting. Hey, let's go fly a kite. Something fun, yeah? There's nothing that we can't cure. And I'll hold you in my arms for sure. Oh, so don't let nobody stop us. Free spirits, we got to soar. Oh, with you I'll share the gift. Oh, the gift that we now know. Sing it. Love is my religion. Yeah. Love is my religion. Sing it, sing it. Love is my religion. Well, you can take it or leave it, and you don't have to believe it. Well, I'm done searching now. I found out what this life is worth. No, it is not in the books I find, but by searching my mind. No, no, I don't condemn, I don't convert. This is the calling, have you heard? Bring all the lovers into the fold, 'cause no one is ever gonna lose their soul. Yeah, yeah. Love is my religion. Every day, every way. Love is my religion. Woo. Love is my religion. Yeah, you can take it or leave it, and you can choose to believe it. Yeah. Love is my religion. Sing it to yourself now. Who is my religion? Yeah, 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 yeah. Love is my religion. You can take it or leave it, but you don't have to believe it.
Father's Day. Father's Day, Father's Day, Father's Day. Fathers are an anomaly in some ways. I remember years ago doing a group over in Everett on The Road Less Traveled with M. Scott Peck, if you remember that book. And one week, the group looked at mothers, and we talked about mothers, and it was really an engaged conversation. The next week, we went to fathers, and it was almost silent. There's a different relationship typically between children, mothers, fathers, yes? So today we're looking at fathers, but we're looking at more than fathers. I want to start with a story about fathers. 3 elderly women, retired, well off, in a really expensive retirement home. And they would get together for lunch occasionally and share stories. And one particular occasion, one of the women spoke up and said, "You know, my son is a doctor. And he is so rich that he just bought me a brand new BMW." Well, the second woman, not to be outdone, said, "Well, that's wonderful. My son is a lawyer, and he just bought me a little beach house down on the ocean." The third woman said, "Well, that's nice. My son goes to therapy 3 days a week, and he spends $300 on each session, and all he talks about is me." So the point of the story, of course, is that one of the points is that modern therapy in this post-Freudian, maybe modern therapy is a redundancy, but therapy in this world that we live in is largely a place where you go to talk about mom and dad and how they, see, we know the story, how they screwed you up. I remember when I went through my second or third midlife crisis back in 1990 when I first started to get associated with this group. I was in that whole John Bradshaw dysfunctional child thing, remember? And I was going to get the family mobile, that balanced out so everybody was in their right role and the whole world would be perfect. And I had gone through a lot of trauma as a child. So I decided the best thing that we could do was to bring the whole family to therapy. I was going, alone, but I thought if I could get my dad, my mom, my brother, and my sister to come with me, we could really get this thing fixed. So it took several months, and I worked on it, and finally I got them all to agree. My dad was the last, but he felt a little pressure because everybody else was going. So we all went to this therapeutic session, and the counselor sat there, and he said, "I'd like each of you to share why you're here." So it started with my mother. She shared why she was here, and basically she talked about my dad, and it wasn't positive. And then it passed to my brother, and he said, "What do you have to say, Eddie?" And he said, "Well," and he talked about my dad. And then it passed over to my sister, and she talked about my dad. And then it was my turn, and I talked about my dad, which I'd been doing for several weeks before that. And finally, I got to my dad's turn. And the therapist looked at him and said, "Dean, what do you have to say about this?" And I'll never forget this, because he looked at this therapist and he said, "F him." The whole lot of them. And I remember thinking, I'm not going to get this fixed. And that was the last family therapy session we ever went to. And I remember learning so much from it. Shortly after that, I got hold of a book by James Hillman. Is there any way to turn the lights down just a little bit here? A book by James Hillman called The Soul's Code, 1996, bestseller. His only really bestseller. And there's a chapter in there entitled Parental Fallacy. And in this chapter, Hillman talks about this modern American culture is fixated on dad and mom. That we go to therapy, and when we think of parenting as the nuclear family, dad and mom, what they said, what they did, is what shaped us, and the traumas that we experienced in that home with those parents is what has affected us for our whole lives. It's okay, I did that. Thank you. She's my assistant today, and she is really assisting. So Hillman suggested that maybe we have what he calls a parental fallacy. that this parental myopia, this focus on dad and mom as basically the sole, or at least the primary reason that we have problems, or that the stories we tell are so screwed up at times, he said, maybe that's not right. And in there, and this is a quote from the book, he said, in our modern world, cosmic parents, like the gods, nature, animals, and ancestors, and that's the part we're going to focus on today, he said, maybe in this modern world, gods, nature, animals, and ancestors are replaced solely by personal mothers and fathers who are divinized, causing effects of cosmic proportions. The result, mom and dad are blamed for everything. Now, what Hillman is suggesting is that in ancient cultures, and I just finished a class here on African religion and mythology, and we looked at this phenomenon in relationship to Africa, the continent of Africa, but it's true in ancient cultures all around that parenting was not narrowed down to just mom and dad. That parenting was done by animals, that is cosmic, the animal lives have to do with the way we become who we are. The gods, and every culture has a number of archetypal patterns of consciousness that are typically symbolized as gods or goddesses. They parent us, and that nature itself, our geography parents us. Do you understand what I mean? If you're raised in Brooklyn compared to where I was raised in Enumclaw, the geography is going to be different. And Hillman suggests that that parents us as well as it ought. And that for us to just focus on mom and dad leaves out the larger picture of what parenting actually is comprised of. Now, he also says, and he deals with this in his book, ancestors, our ancestry, those many, 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 many hundreds, if not thousands of parents that came before us are somehow affecting who we are to this day. I mean, in some of the classes I've done, I've asked the question and tried to find a guinea pig who will answer it the right way, and said, you know, who screwed you up? And they'll say, Dad. I say, who screwed your dad up? And then, of course, the answer is his dad. I say, who screwed his dad up? His dad. And I just keep them going as far as we can go, and I say, okay, now we get back to the first dad. Who screwed him up? They're not really sure how to answer that question. So I suggested that maybe our screwiness is an archetypal pattern or patterns of consciousness that make us each come to this planet with unique problems, and that the assignment was given to the first parent. And that parent took that assignment and worked, probably several assignments, worked with it as best he or she could, and then passed it down to the next generation and the next and the next and the next, so that by the end of this long, long story, I mean, it would make Tolkien's trilogy look small, but the trilogy of Tolkien is closer probably to who we are than this little myopic vision of dad and mom and me. That we are this long ancestral story, and that each ancestor has a chapter or a paragraph or a sentence, or maybe just an exclamation point or a question mark here and there. That each of us is a piece of this larger story, so that by the time we get to this world and this life, we are going to therapy and bringing with us whom? A whole ancestry. So it is not just my story, it is our story. It is a huge story. And that reframes our whole existence in a way that is phenomenal. I mean, think about it. At the end of The Hobbit, for those of you who are Hobbit fans, you remember Bilbo. Gandalf comes along and says to the little hobbit in the Shire, in the hole, and those definite articles are important because it's the hole, it's my hole, it's my Shire, it's my little tiny life. Gandalf, the wizard, calls him out of the hole and out of the Shire and out into the larger adventure of the world. And Bilbo has all these amazing adventures and all these close calls and parties with elves and killing a dragon and bringing home the gold. This huge story. And at the end of The Hobbit, the very last lines go something like this. They're back in the Shire. The adventure is over. They're sitting there, smoking pipes together, Gandalf and Bilbo. And Bilbo asks a question, I'm paraphrasing it, says something like this. He says, am I really to believe the prophecies are true? And what was my role in this adventure? And Gandalf looks at him and says, Bilbo, you are a quite wonderful little fellow, but you are a very tiny little fellow in a very large world. And then Bilbo, the story ends, Bilbo passed the tobacco pipe, or the tobacco, and said, thank goodness. Tolkien knew goodness. As a Roman Catholic, he was a sort of a Platonist, and the good is the infinite. And so Bilbo in this story ends intentionally with the idea that everything that happens in our lives is part of the goodness. That there is, in that story, this vast ancestral story, all kinds of things that happen, but it's all connected. That at the very end, there's a sense in which each of us is quite a tiny little person in this vast cosmic ancestral story that we're part of, but we're an important person. Does that make sense? Now, what I want to do this morning with our few minutes here is give you a piece of what science, most of us are caught up in the myth of science, and I'm not saying that negatively, but we're caught up in the myth of science. So when science comes along with something that confirms our pathetic little spirituality, we're all excited. It's like, oh, good, the scientists agree with us. We're so happy. Well, science, and that's fine, science has come up with some very interesting evidence for this ancestral theory in cellular research. And I want to present some of that this morning. Actually, before I get to that, I want to read this quote from Jung because it leads into it. Jung talks about his relationship to ancestors. And in his biography, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, he writes this. He's in his 80s at this point. He said, in the winter of 1955 through 56, I chiseled the names of my parental ancestors on 3 stone tablets and placed them in the courtyard of the tower. Jung had built this little kind of a castle, stone castle retreat on Lake Zurich in 1923, and over the years he would work on it. In the 1950s, he started working on ancestral stuff. He began to realize how important the ancestors were in his own process. He said, so I placed these names on the tower. I painted the ceiling with motifs from my own wife's coat of arms and from those of my sons-in-law. So you get the picture here? These towers with the ancestral names. On the ceiling, these coat of arms. He's surrounding himself because before that it was just Jung in his little retreat. And now he's suggesting that maybe he's in this retreat with many other presences. He goes on and says, when I was working on the stone tablets, I became aware of the fateful links between me and my ancestors. I feel very strongly that I am under the influence. This is important. We hear this a lot about driving under the influence. This is growing under the influence of things or questions which were left incomplete and unanswered by my parents and grandparents and more distant ancestors. It often seems as if there were an impersonal karma within a family, which is passed on from parents to children. It has always seemed to me that I had to answer questions which fate had posed to my forefathers and which had not yet been answered, or as if I had to what? Complete or perhaps continue things which previous ages had left unfinished. So, the cellular piece. Superorganism theory. How many of you are familiar with this notion of superorganism? What's a superorganism? See, in the church I work with over on Bainbridge, I ask these questions and people help teach with me. What's a superorganism? A really big organism. That's a great start. Comprised of many small pieces or lives. So there are many tiny organisms in the larger organism. Now we know this to be true of bacteria. Bacteria is an organism, a superorganism, but it's comprised of many little living pieces of bacteria. We know it's true of ant colonies. If you take an ant out of a colony and place it out in a solitary place, what happens to the ant? It'll die because it's part of the superorganism. Same thing with bees. Insects especially live in these sort of the Borg, if you're, Star Trek fans. So this complexity of the superorganism has been, around for a while, but there's new work being done suggesting that human beings are superorganisms. First of all, at the bacterial level, that many of us are, or all of us are comprised of a lot of bacteria. You are crawling with bacteria. That's why when you go out to buy yogurt, you buy probiotic yogurt because it keeps the bacteria healthy. So you want your superorganism to be healthy. Well, now they are extending this notion of the superorganism from insects and bacteria to the human cellular system. That the human cells are actually kinds of living organisms that work together to form this sort of living being. And that more importantly, the cells are more than just your 7th grade science textbook picture. Remember that? The problem with these terms that we use is we think we know what they mean. Does that make sense? Cells are more than cells, at least traditionally understood. So what they're starting to write on now, and there's a whole bunch of work coming out on this idea, the human superorganism, or superorganism, learning to love your inner ecosystem. That the cellular system actually comprises a kind of organic anthill. Now, one story in particular really stresses this. Lydia Fairchild. Anybody familiar with her that wasn't at the first service? Lydia Fairchild went to court. She had 2 little boys with a man that left, and she wanted him to pay child support. So she went to court to get child support for these 2 little boys. The judge said, we need to do a paternity test on you and the father. Well, the test results came back, and they had their day in court, and the judge said, I have some good news and I have some bad news for you, Lydia. And she said, what? He said, well, the good news is that the man that you said is the father is the father. Our paternity test shows that. The bad news is your test shows that you are not the mother. And she said, Your Honor, I was there. I happen to know that I am the mother. And there were others in the courtroom that said we were there too. She gave birth to these 2 little boys. Well, it just so happened that her attorney had somehow come across some research, because this was the area that he worked in, some research, and he stood before the judge and he said, Your Honor, he said, and he presented the paper, he says, we have evidence that there are experiments now where there have been women who were in utero and had a little sibling fetus in there with them that was absorbed into the person that was born. So only one person was born, but originally started as 2. And this is what happened with Lydia Fairchild. She had evidently been in utero, absorbed her sister, so that when she gave birth to these 2 little boys, the little boys had her sister's DNA and blood type. It's not as unusual as you would think, although a little creepy. It's interesting, after the first service, I think I had 4 different people say to me independently, you blew my mind, that was creepy. Lydia Fairchild, and this is a quote, said, telling my sons about this was the hardest part because I felt that part of me, and this tells us a lot about this sort of culture, is, it's all about me, hadn't been passed on to them. I thought, I wonder if they'll really feel that I'm not quite their real mother somehow because the genes that I should have given them, I didn't give to them. Isn't this interesting? Some of this research is being done at the University of Washington. Some other things they're finding in this, what I'm calling ancestral cell research, it's not them, so don't blame them for what I make up, that cells from merging fetuses in the womb prior to birth. In other words, there's evidence that babies are born and there is residual, if the mother has had children before, there are residual cells from the other children that go into the 2nd, 3rd, 4th firstborns. So we are walking around with more than one person living in us. So that instead of saying I, we might say we. Don't. Because you will be on drugs if you do that. Cells from an older sibling in the mother's body. They're also finding in this research that after children are born, they're finding residual cells in the body of the mother. And in fact, they have done some experiments where they have examined the brains of these mothers and found that the cells of their children are residing in their brain after the child has developed in the womb. So what? Well, I'm going to extrapolate this on a little bit before I close here and suggest this. We now have evidence from cellular research that cells are more than cells. I put cells in quotes because I think that maybe we should consider calling cells chapters. That the chapters of the books that were written, or the stories that were written before us, are being passed along to each of us. That the cellular, I think at some point in the future, we're going to find that cells and DNA are much more than these sort of objective facts with just the stuff that tells what we're supposed to look like. We're going to find more and more that the cells and the DNA contain the stories. Do you ever feel like you inherited stories? This idea, and this is part of depth psychology and what Jung was talking about, suggests that many of us inherit the karmic pathologies of our parents, and of our parents' parents, and of our parents' parents' parents. And if you take this all the way back to the very beginning, it would suggest that there was an assignment given to the family that I can't blame all the way back to infinity. You understand? That when I go to therapy, I can't just say, Mom did it to me or Dad did it to me. At some point, we have to say, something showed up in that first parent that has been passed down in the story through cells and other, means. But I am here today as part of a bigger story. Now, I really like Jung's idea of fate and karma, and I want to close with this. Well, Jung, part of what he's talking about when it came to family karma was he had no respect for his father in this area. His father was a Swiss Reformed minister. And Jung said Jung remembered as a young boy listening to his father bitch and complain about the dogmas he'd been taught, that he didn't believe many of them any longer, that he wanted to leave the church. But he was afraid to leave the church because it was his career, his retirement benefits. It was his peer body was there. His associates were there. To leave the church and leave that job would be to lose his life. So Jung said, I would watch him go into the pulpit on Sunday mornings and preach the dogmas that he didn't believe. He said, I lost all respect for him. Fast forward to Jung's life. Jung is in his late 20s, early 30s, and he meets Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud was the rock star psychologist of the world. I mean, Freud was the Russell Wilson of psychologists. Freud, Jew, meets Jung, Swiss. Freud says, I need a non-Jew to be part of this, to make this bigger. Jews weren't very popular in Europe. So I said, I need to bring this Swiss fella in. In fact, he was so impressed, Freud was, with Jung, that he said he's going to be my heir apparent. So here's Jung next in line to be the next big psychological rock star. But he finds himself in his father's shoes because he starts disagreeing with Dr. Freud, especially around these ideas of the collective unconscious. For Freud, our psychological problems are all pretty much contained within our personal consciousness and our personal unconscious. For Jung, those are there, but there's this collective unconscious or this archetypal realm that we're rooted in that is bigger. And when Jung came to Freud and shared this collective unconscious idea, of course, Freud said, what's the German word for crazy? Nine. Say it again. Verrückt. Close enough. You're crazy. So Jung goes home, and he asks himself this question, this karmic ancestral conundrum. What is it? What am I going to do? And then he said, my dad's vision flashed before me, as if to say, now it's your turn. Jung broke with Freud and had a nervous breakdown. He went home and collapsed at the age of 37. He said he couldn't work, he couldn't do anything. He sat in his study in the dark, and he said at one moment he fell down into the depths of the basement of the unconscious, and a new psychology was born. But it was through breaking that ancestral pattern that the new came into being. So what I'm here to say on this Father's Day as we close is let's expand our idea of parenting. Let's give mom and dad a effing break. And if you're a parent, buy this talk and have your kids listen to it. Because I'll never forget, my daughters came to me 3 or 4 years ago and said, Dad, we realized it's not all your fault. Probably enough said, but I will read this. I was sitting over here a few minutes ago, and this kind of popped into my mind, which happens occasionally. Every cemetery is a library, an archive of ancestral stories and family lore. When you walk through the cemetery, you're walking through a library, and you are one book in that large library. Blessings.